Hi, I'm Cassandra. I'm studying creative writing and environmental studies at Hamline University, and recently read The Quickening by Elizabeth Rush. This video is a deep dive into the book, containing a broad overview while particularly centering in on a few strong narrative points, drawing out evidence while extrapolating to bigger picture questions and considerations. This is a nonfiction book about the author's journalistic voyage participating in a 57-member crew embarking on an Antarctic voyage, and the magic is in the details. I will not be spoiling anything that is super pertinent to your read. This video could serve you before, during, or after you've read the book, and could be a way to get the SparkNotes version if you never end up reading it. So first, a little bit about the author, and then we'll talk about ice. There will be information about climate change in this video, but there will be hope too, and narrative deep dives. So without further ado, this is Elizabeth Rush's latest book, The Quickening, Creation and Community at the Ends of the Earth. She has also written Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore, which is about the early impact that sea level rise is having across America. The Quickening takes place on a ship, more specifically the Nathaniel B. Palmer. It's a 94-meter research ship with ice-breaking capability built for the U.S. Antarctic program. The ship was built as a platform for global climate change studies. The ship has the ability to study biological, oceanographic, geological, and geophysical components. Throughout this journey to Antarctica, The Quickening explores narrative threads such as gender, deciding whether or not to have kids, considering climate projections for the 21st century. This book explores the actual scientific process that goes into Antarctic expedition. Also, narratives such as equality, the history of female expeditioners, the unwritten history of non-scientist crew members, such as cooks and mechanics. The Quickening took Elizabeth Rush 5 years to complete and was published in 2023 by Milkweed Editions. The actual Antarctic voyage took place in 2019, when 57 scientists and crew boarded the Palmer. Elizabeth Rush had applied for a grant through the National Science Foundation to attend this voyage as a journalist and author, with the idea of writing a book based on the communication, information, stories, and truths that emerged from this voyage to the bottom of the Earth. The ship set course for Thwaites Glacier, which is actually listed in the cast of characters for this book. Thwaites Glacier, Antarctica, the most important character in this play, the one that moves all the others. So that's listed as the last character in the cast of characters. Thwaites Glacier is truly the star of this show, and Rush does an excellent job here encapsulating that through this book. According to this source linked on screen, Thwaites Glacier is the single widest glacier in the world. It has an area of 192,000 square kilometers. That's the equivalent of 74,000 square miles. This makes it larger than the American state of Florida, which is 170,000 square kilometers or 66,000 square miles. It's also very tall, with ice thickness from bedrock to surface measuring between 800 meters and 1,200 meters. A lot of Thwaites Glacier is actually under the water surface because of how heavy it is. And according to the resource linked on screen, over the past 30 years, the amount of ice flowing out of Thwaites and its neighboring glaciers has nearly doubled, and already accounts for 4% of world sea level rise, a huge figure for a single glacier. There's enough water locked up in it to raise world sea levels by more than half a meter if the entire glacier were to melt. Scientists say that almost a quarter of the West Antarctic ice sheet can now be considered unstable, with more ice being lost from the region than is being replenished through snowfall. Another huge concern when it comes to Thwaites Glacier, there is now widespread agreement that its loss is likely to pave the way for the loss of the entire West Antarctic ice sheet, which would raise the sea levels by around 3.3 meters or 10 feet over centuries or millennia. Elizabeth Rush, along with this cast of characters, are the first people to have ever made it to Thwaites Glacier, ever. And they are the only ones who have ever been there at the time that this was recorded. So, like I said, this book is written in a cast format. For the scenes that are set out on the Palmer, the ship is either parked in the harbor, trekking through open water, plowing through ice, sometimes struggling quite a bit to do so, as you may be able to imagine. The ship is also eventually near, at, and around Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica. During the thread of this book that takes place on the Palmer, Elizabeth Rush is interacting, observing, and existing within this ship, out at sea with this cast of crew members she has listed here. Something evident and eloquently portrayed is the sense of isolation this crew experienced from the rest of the world. In an interview with the Pell Center, Rush said, early on in her program, her advisor through the National Science Foundation called her in an attempt to prepare Rush for what was to come, and said, where you're going, it will be harder for us to get help to you than it will be for us to get help to someone on the space station. That fact helps elicit the very real sense of danger and isolation that this crew faced in an untouched and unseen, desolate landscape. Along these same lines, this crew is on this boat for 59 days. Rush does a great job giving voices to this crew, whose history might have otherwise not have been written. One of the cast of characters, for example, is a cook, Julian Isaacs, from Jamaica. Some of the cooks on board had been to Antarctica several times. These are great details that Rush seamlessly threads into the narrative, giving a wider perspective to all the stories and histories that go into such an intense expedition like this. And all the people, stories, and histories that have, past tense, gone into all the historical Antarctic voyages, where white men have named glaciers, peaks, passes, and landmarks after themselves. For example, the first landing on the Antarctic mainland is thought to have been made by the American captain John Davis, a sealer who claimed to have set foot there on February 7, 1821. Rush talks about this history within the thread of this book, which takes place outside of the Palmer. The chapters in this thread take place outside of the ship, and they aren't chronological. They take place from Rush's perspective, some of them before she was on Thwaites, some of them after. The pattern of these chapters does flow nicely. They follow a rhythm that weaves together well with the cast of characters, chapters that take place on the ship. She talks about how she'd gone to a library in preparation for the trip to Thwaites to learn as much as she could about the history of Antarctic voyages, dating back to the 1800s. The histories that have been taught are that of white men, and not their crews, and not their wives who they brought for company, and not of the female scientists who were on board discovering the same land as their male counterparts. Rush brings light to these truths throughout this book. The entire text is filled with discussion on gender. Rush discusses her desire to become a mother that she faced before and while on board the Palmer. Rush and her husband Felipe were planning to begin the process of having a child after she got home from Antarctica, which for context began right around the same time as COVID spread to America and globally. Rush doesn't shy away from including this context into this text, going off of that to a broader perspective, bringing in the key narrative elements here. Thwaites Glacier is the star of this show, not only of this book, but of you and I's lives. We are all dependent on the stability of Antarctica's ice. This desolate landscape at the bottom of the earth, which you and I will likely never come to see, hear, taste, or touch, unlike Elizabeth Rush and the Palmer's crew of explorers. This landscape controls our fate and the climate of the entire globe. The continent of Antarctica has been uniquely stable for the last 6,000 years. In terms of its stability throughout the history of planet Earth in its entirety, however, that stability has changed in the last 100 years. What modern humans have understood to be a reliable climate is changing. This change directly coincides with the change of Antarctica's ice sheet. Fossil fuels have been burned at an unprecedented and unregulated rate. This has led to what scientists agree is human-driven increased presence of atmospheric greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide. While at the same time, this planet has experienced the human-driven, unprecedented, and unregulated deforestation and destruction of wetlands and overdevelopment of natural landscapes. This has taken away many carbon sinks, which help to regulate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by storing it. Some greenhouse gases, such as hydrochlorofluorocarbons, or HFCs, don't exist in nature. Because of all of these factors, the Earth's average temperature has raised about 1.9 degrees throughout the 20th century. It's also important to note that while climate change affects everyone, it doesn't do so equally. For example, if you have the privilege of not believing in climate change, or perhaps ignoring it for the most part, you most likely live in an area that is not being as directly affected by it. Economically disadvantaged or politically marginalized communities worldwide are currently living in the future many Americans are afraid of. For them, climate change isn't an idea, but is a daily, life-threatening reality. This is particularly fraught because these developing communities did not contribute to the human-driven increased presence of greenhouse gases. These communities have been living well below their means, living interdependently with nature rather than exploiting it. However, climate change is hitting them the hardest because of developed countries' overconsumption. A self-care practice that helps me a lot is to look at the history of the Earth with a wider lens on time. We're living in the 6th mass extinction. That means that there have been other mass extinctions, 5 of them, but life has found a way to survive. Life lives at the bottom of the ocean and in volcanoes. Throughout all of the history of Earth from the Great Bang, life has persisted as it's come to be. While the climate news is incredibly painful and jarring, one thing that we can count on is that life will go on. Earth isn't going anywhere. Humans are animals, and we evolved on this earth. I don't think shaming or guilt-tripping one another or our species will get us anywhere. We have proven that our current way of living isn't sustainable. Theology aside, the Earth is going to find its equilibrium back one way or another, and that's okay. All of this is hard to learn about and requires a grieving process. And I hope you allow yourself to grieve all of the stages, and in as many iterations of those stages as you need. Grief is a beautiful and intelligent somatic process that deserves to be honored and experienced to its full capacity. I encourage you to not move through your grief, but to let your grief move you. Let it guide you. Observe it with curiosity. See what action steps come out on the other side and what butterfly effects you might have on this world because of it. I recommend this book if you want to take a deeper dive into anything I just mentioned. It's called Not Too Late. It's an anthology. Now, of all the strongest narrative elements that I pulled from this text is the fact that Thwaites Glacier is a lot like a mother. This indescribably, astronomically sized glacier grew out of this earth, and it holds the fate of the next few centuries in its hands. Much like a mother holds the fate of their child. Much like Rush held the fate of her future child within her on this voyage. Metaphors aside, Rush grapples with the question of ethical responsibility and raising a child as a climate-aware adult, looking towards the possibilities of late 21st century news. Rush does an excellent job at never directly answering that question for the reader. She had a kid after this expedition, which that means that she looked Thwaites Glacier in its melting body, in the eye, and she decided she still wanted to bring life into this world. She brings up reasonable evidence on both sides of the argument. I would say that this book is somewhat biased towards not blaming the individual for climate disaster and not putting an individual's choice to procreate at the center of that discussion. As if it is going to prevent that glacier from melting significantly more as a standalone choice. Thwaites Glacier's quickening is the result of an almost inconceivable amount of butterfly effects that have mostly been made by people with a heck of a lot more power than any one person should ever have. The quickening has been caused by men in corner offices running the 12 wealthiest companies in the world that chose endless pits of money over the lives of billions of living organisms, deliberately, not on accident, but on purpose. To keep with the metaphor, they are hurting our mother, Mother Nature, their mother. Coinciding natural disasters are becoming more extreme. We're in the 6th mass extinction, in the age of the Anthropocene, and Mother Nature will protect herself. The human race is at the disposal of our home, of Thwaites Glacier, of the infinite facets within this life-giving universe. We are interdependent with all of it, not independent from it. Unfortunately, to all the people that are not the CEOs of the top wealthiest fossil fuel producing companies in the world, we lack a lot of control over the future here. Remember that we can flip the narrative. Climate change can be considered an earth flu, and the earth needs to sneeze out all her contaminants to find her equilibrium back. We can help the earth heal from this flu and take care of the earth to the best of our ability. And after that, all we can do is trust that the earth will find its equilibrium back eventually. Thank you so much for watching and reflecting on these massive topics with me, both literally and figuratively. I am so grateful to have read this book and to have gotten the opportunity to share this discussion with you. All the resources I used and cited will be linked in the description box below. Until next time, I hope you all take care, everybody.